The car was having a little cooling issues. What looks to be happening is the thermostat is sticking open, and it was causing the engine to not get up to proper normal temperature, especially on colder days or even on warm days. If you're out there on the highway, the car wouldn't get to full optimal temperature. That tells me the thermostat's stuck open. I have ordered in a new replacement coolant thermostat housing here. This one here is made out of plastic. Still seems to be in good shape. I kind of like the idea of the aluminum design, as well as it's a known area of failure. So might as well just go ahead and get it off, being as though I'm going to be replacing the thermostat anyhow. Simply just pop that out of that clip. These here should lift straight up. It does look like we're going to have to take the coolant reservoir out of the way so we can get this one up. So the reservoir has some Torx bolts holding that on. It's just a single Torx right on the side, and then it's got a pin that slides into the carrier in the back with a rubber grommet. You've got a level sensor with a connector on it, and you've got a return line here going across that we already popped off the clip, and you've also got another line here on the back side that run down to the heater valve, I believe is where it's going. I'm not positive. That's what it looks like it's doing. Now some of these have one-time use clamps on them. Pretty much they've got some teeth that there's some holes in the other side, line up, and once you catch it on there, you crimp it, it's done. It's been used for its one time. Okay, so now we've got our reservoir loose enough that we can get this out of the way. So as I mentioned, you've got two kind of slide-ons. They go on these bolts here. You also have these two pegs, and they'll go down off on the intake, and that keeps that held down in place. Do be careful removing these. They will break. I've seen a lot of them with these that are broken, especially this kind of thinner section that shoots off here in the front, and especially the ones in the back. So unless you want a broken one of those, be careful. But you can slide it out. Once again, the rubber grommet for the studs on the valve cover, and the two pins that slide down, the little rubber grommets on the intake plenum. Alright, so we need to get this air intake out. Looks like we've got a couple of bolts here to take loose to get off here. This throttle body is back here. Also looks like we've got, of course, the hand squeeze clamp here. Once again, be careful with that. I've seen these get cracked and busted, so that came off nice and easy. I've got the aftermarket air intake on it. I'll be leaving this in place. I do have a flat head here that I can take loose. That'll let me take this whole intake tube off and get it out of the way. These two 8mm bolts out of the way. And there we go there. That's loose. So I've got that loose now. Kind of had to rock that up to get it off this rubber grommet here. And now the intake is off. The intake off, that leaves your throttle body wide open. You cover that up so we don't have something fall down in there that we don't want down in there. I've watched a couple other people's videos on this, and I've seen people cutting and grinding on the new replacement to make these rear tube bolts, their holes slotted, so that they can, in essence, can slide this housing just right back in place and then tighten those bolts down. I'm not a big fan of that idea. By doing that, you're creating a structural weakness on the thermostat housing at that point. So I'm going to avoid that at all costs. If I have to pull my plenum, I will pull the plenum. But I'm somewhat confident we can get into these and not have to pull the plenum. So this housing here, the front section here, it branches between the two heads and then also feeds down into the thermostat housing. We're going to have to get that thing off, as well as our hose here for our reservoir line. Simply going to take this hose clamp loose for the reservoir line. That one's out of the way. We also have a few sensors here. We want to make sure that those are connected properly when we go back together, so be sure and remember which one goes to which. Typically they are slotted so that there's only one connector can go to one device when they're this close, but just be vigilant on that. Sometimes they don't do that. If you have to put it back on, it's nice to know which one goes to which. So we have a larger tube here, and we've got a smaller tube here. The smaller tube looks like it runs underneath the plenum back to the back of the engine. So to just simply do the thermostat, you would not have to take all this loose. The thermostat is actually right here. So once you have the radiator hoses off, you could actually get to this right here by going through the front, undoing, looks like 3 bolts, remove this front housing, and then there's your thermostat right there. You take that loose, put the new thermostat in. Be sure to follow your direction of the thermostat. They have a little marking on them, it usually points up. That is important to make sure you get that right back the same way it came off. So just be sure and follow any markings you find. These 2 clamps I'm taking off now are just spring style clamps. Simply squeeze them together and move them back. These hoses may need a slight twist like this. Be sure not to grip real hard, and if it binds, don't go to prying real hard either with those pliers, because you'll just chew up the rubber. And once you get it kind of worked loose, just give it a wiggle, it should slide off. Now this one up here is a little different. I'm just going to go ahead and jiggle it a little bit just to get it broke loose. That won't actually come off because it's just such a short hose. It's not going to come off until I start taking this housing off. So it looks like it has 2 bolts on either side. We're going to see if we can get that off now. So we are going to have to lift the plenum, but it doesn't look too bad. I think just that, I think that's all we're going to do is lift it, not actually take it out. All you got to do is take loose the 5 bolts on either side that hold the plenum down to each head. And there's one in between each runner, and then one on either end of the plenum. Now back on this side here, there's some hoses kind of in the way. I didn't have to take them loose, but I had to kind of get my socket down off in there without breaking any of that stuff. You just kind of had to pull it back a little bit and slide the socket down in there. Of course, got to be careful when you're coming back out so you don't catch it on something and pop your socket off down the valley of the intake. Now, as old as this car is, there's no guarantee that my seals are going to hold, but if your seals are pretty new, you're probably going to be okay. That's a chance we're going to take on this one. If the seals don't hold and I have running issues after this, I will be taking the plenum back off and replacing the plenum seals. So our plenum is loose. See if I can get it to lift up out of here. Just enough to give me room to get down to those bolts. Now the fuel rails, injectors, and everything are right here on top of this, so do be careful not to damage those as you're trying to pop this up. As old as this car is, I'm sure it's going to be held on pretty good by those seals. All the years they've been kind of baked in there. They're going to be a bit tight, I'm sure. So at this point, I'm going to use a pry bar. I need to be sure and catch on a very strong point of the intake plenum. Remember, this is plastic. If you can catch on something metal, that's great. I'm not seeing a whole lot of metal here, so I don't think my options are going to be optimal for that. What I'm going to try right now is just simply popping it loose, and I'm just doing ever such a light kind of bounce here instead of just simply getting on here and prying. But I'm doing this at each one of the runner points, as well as the injector is right there at the base of that runner, and just giving it a little jiggle. So it looks like there's a bracket on the back of this throttle body that is holding it in place. See if that'll give me the extra play I need to get the plenum up and out of the way. So you will have to be careful back in here. There are a lot of plastic connectors and hoses and whatnot. So do be careful working back here and not prying against things. Wind up cracking connectors if you're not careful. This appears to be a much smaller size on one side than the other. On the passenger side, the right side, it was a 13 millimeter. Felt closer to a 10 on this passenger or on the driver's side. Sure enough, that's what it is. This is where, because of the location, a lot has to do with more of touch and feel than actual seeing what you're doing. Unfortunately, it's just easier to get to it from this opposite side. I'm just simply stretching across the car here to get over to it. And this is why your mechanic charges you so much, because this will put quite a bit of stress on your legs, back, and knees to get down off into this. So I had to use a swivel with a 10mm socket on a 3/8 drive. Finally get it to break loose. Used about a 3-4 inch extension there on the swivel with a 10mm to get the leverage I needed to break that bolt loose. Like I said, on this opposite side, the passenger side, that is a 13mm is what was on mine. I don't know if somebody lost the bolt or what happened, but it is possible. I actually dropped mine, but there it is. There's a 10mm bolt with a flange that was on the driver's side. I believe now, yep, now that has given me the ability to loosen up this intake plenum just a little bit more. And I think that may give me what I need to actually get it up off so I can actually replace that housing. So after comparing the two bolts, yes, they are the same thread, they are the same size, so I have a feeling somebody lost that bolt once before, and that's why it was a 13mm on the opposite side. The 10mm with the flange looked more factory. So at this point, we're going to try lifting the intake plenum again, see if we get quite a bit more movement, which it looks like we are getting a lot more movement. I think that will give us what we need. And once again, I'm going to go in from the front side here, see if I can get as much movement as I can out of this. I think I can get a swivel socket down off in there at this point and get those loose. So I had to take the bolts out of both sides of the intake plenum, completely out, not just loose, to get a little more play. I think I had the back left bolt was still catching on some threads, I believe. I didn't think I had it all the way out, so that kept me from moving a little bit as well. Once I got those bolts out of the way, that allowed me to get much more play out of the intake plenum, and I was able to get the passenger side out with just a 10mm 1/4 inch drive swivel and a nice extension. So I still got one left to get out, so I got to get this driver's side out. And there we go. 10mm on the swivel with the long extension on a 1/4 inch wrench. I was able to get us out. Use a magnet to get our bolt. Now the bolts on the rear are actually a little shorter than the bolts on the front. So keep that in mind when you go back together. That'll make it a lot easier getting all that put back together. So at this point, we've got the housing loose. Give it a little jiggle. Yep, there we go, a little coolant coming out. And now we can actually get to these connectors and pop them loose so we can replace this housing. It's a bit more work, but it is definitely worth it, so you don't have to modify anything. You're going to have a proper fit on everything. You don't have to worry about whether or not you've risked the integrity of the new housing by cutting on it. You should be able to feel pretty safe and secure about the install when you're all said and done, and enjoy your car. So these do have quick release tangs on the back side here. Push those in and then slide the whole unit. You don't even have to disconnect the connector. That little mounting post there. Like I said, one on either side. Now you do have an O-ring on the bottom side here. You're going to replace that as well. Now if you have concerns about your water pump, this is a good time to look into that, because your water pump is just right here. What I'm doing now is pulling enough coolant out so that I have it below the seal, so I can clean off my seal area and make sure it's going to be nice and smooth and clean. So when I put my new part down, if you leave a bunch of debris or anything like that around, you might wind up having a water leak and wind up having to pull all this stuff loose again just to clean it up and reseal it. So best to do it right the first time. Cleaning any water out of these screw holes that I can get out. You can use compressed air or canned air if you want to blow it out. Just be sure not to blow down into the block here, because you'll wind up getting yourself good and sprayed all over with coolant. I'm just using a rag and using a dry tip of it, wadding it up and cramming it down the hole to absorb the majority of that water. I think we're looking pretty good. I am going to take a scraper though and just gently go over it. Actually, I'll probably wind up just be using just a straight razor blade and just kind of cleaning off the contact surface here. There is a little dried on stuff from all the years of driving. And when you do that, you want to be sure and scrape it outwards, away from the port where the coolant is. scrape it towards it, you're going to be just scraping all that stuff, of course, down inside there. Next thing you know, you're going to have a messed up water pump or a stuck thermostat again. So I'm just going to take a nice fresh razor blade and scrape ever so gently away from the opening. You do not need to be applying a lot of pressure. Just simply run it across the top and clean off your blade ever so often. Alrighty, there we go. Just a little bit of cleaning. Just going to take our finger, go over it, make sure we don't have any heavy residue anywhere. Just had one more spot with a little bit of residue. We got that off, so I think we're ready to start prepping our new assembly to go back in. So here's the tube we're going to be reusing, but I'm just going to clean this up a little bit with the rag, get all the extra residue out, such as that right there, just coolant that's got all caught in the seal ports and all that. So here's the new thermostat. What I noticed on the old thermostat here was that it's kind of caught at an angle here. I don't know how well you can see that, but how this one kind of fits, this inner piece kind of snaps right down off in this ring here. It's kind of hard to see because it's all the same color. But this center piece here, this first and second flat plane, that's the center section that opens as the coolant gets warm and it allows it to flow. Well, this one here is actually caught at an angle. It's not opening and closing properly, of course, like I said. So you can see this one here is actually, the spring is almost setting up on the edge. So it's been having some trouble. So it's, like I said, seems to be acting like it's stuck open. Most likely it's letting just enough coolant by there that it won't let it get to optimal temperature. We've got the little eyelet here that lets just a little bit of coolant in until it gets nice and warm, and this opens up and allows, of course, a much higher flow going, keeps your engine at the proper temperature. So we've got a new seal. It just simply snaps around this outer edge. You will have to kind of stretch the rubber around it, but you should have rubber on both sides now. And here's our housing, nice new housing in aluminum. We're going to take our new thermostat and we're going to line up on this support piece here they did with our inlet valve. Make sure that we're getting the coolant in like we should. So that'll let a little hot coolant flow in until it opens up completely, and then it'll of course let it flow much freer. So we've got our gasket in here. Push that down nice and tight. You can use a little gasket lubricant if you wish. Just make sure it is okay to use within a cooling system. Don't want it to contaminate your coolant. The nipple only goes on one way, as you can see. So it only goes just like that. Now it does have some play, so you will have to kind of line it up on the holes. We've got our bolts over here, so we're going to run those in, making sure that our thermostat has not moved. And we're not going to torque these down until the unit's completely on the car. We'll get these lower ones in and torque down before we do that. We'll come back to these and torque them once everything else is in place. Now our cap, there was a brand new O-ring for our cap as well. We're just putting this on here to keep anything from falling down in here as we put all this back together. Just making sure this is down as tight as we can with our fingers. And like I said, we'll torque it back when it's on the car. We also had a new O-ring for down here. It has some lobed areas on the ring that help hold it in place. I've already actually pushed that in place. So that'll help keep it in place so that when you go to put it on the car, you don't have to worry about that ring falling. You also have these little tabs here to make sure that it lines up properly with the opening on the engine. And of course, that's where our little stubby hose will go. So this new one's going to be a lot tighter than that old one because it hasn't been stretched out or anything. But you can kind of work it around before you go to put it on, and that'll help get it on there. So just simply work it until it eventually gets around, and there you go. Make sure it's down all the way. We have our two clamps from the original. There's no reason to replace them. They're still in good shape. So there we go. I'm just going to compress those so it's on. Now the hose clamp does kind of hit our plate here, but it does get past the nipple part of the hose here, or of the aluminum. So we're good there. You got that back there, so that should hold it tight. Once again, we're going to clean off our other hose clamp and have it ready and on the piece already. So when we put this on the car, we are ready to go. Just slide that back on once we've got the radiator hose in place. So we've got our tube, got our seals on there, everything cleaned up, wiped down, ready to go. Just want to make sure we get all the grime and stuff off before we go back on. It's a lot easier to clean it when it's off the car than it is on the car. So take a moment to do a good cleaning. This is your original piece. It's actually fairly thin plastic. You can actually see right there, hopefully y'all can see that, but there is a crack right there. Good thing I did order the whole housing, not just a new thermostat. That probably wasn't going to last a whole lot longer. It's a big reason why I'm replacing all this, is because I'm not a big fan of plastic. So if I get a chance to replace it with some aluminum, I'm going to. I want to get y'all a little better look down in here, because you can't really tell from some of the other angles. So that's where you're mounting to. You got your two close to the intake plenum here. That's where your shorter bolts are going to go, and then your longer bolts are going to go in those two closer to the pulley there. So, like I said, you want to get in here and clean that contact point real good. Make sure there's no debris there. You also wind up getting quite a bit of coolant in these two little banks on either side there towards the front, in between the water pump and where that housing goes on. So you want to be sure and clean that out with the rag. Also, as I mentioned before, we do have the plenum loose. You can see that darker section. That's where the fuel and everything's been going by. That's where the gasket's been resting. So when we go back down, we're going to have to go down as smooth as we can, right back down to where we were. Worst case scenario, it doesn't seal up, and I do have to wind up taking the intake plenum completely off and then cleaning all that stuff up and replacing the plenum seals. But we're going to cross our fingers. Hopefully we get lucky and those seals are still soft enough and good enough to seal. It's got those little tangs that'll help line you up. You gently set it down, don't force anything. Hold this in place. I've got my screws over here. And we've got longer ones in the front, shorter ones in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get this front one here in. These are the 8mm bolts. Just going to spin this one down a little bit. I'm not going to snug it up at all. We just want to get it far enough down just to kind of hold it in place. It is fairly top heavy. It wants to wobble around on me. So I've got those down, just ever so lightly snugged up on them. And check our ports here on the back side. Probably have to use a magnet to put these in so we don't drop them down off in the valley. You're simply going to put the bolt on the end of the magnet and pop it down in there. Just kind of roll the magnet off the bolt after it's down the hole. Alright, that one started pretty good. Last but not least, we're going to get the opposite side. Once again, use a magnet. You do not have a whole lot of room. Alright, and that one's down. Now the torque specs for these bolts is 8 to 12 Newton meters. And that's on the thermostat flange as well as the housing to the engine. And that also includes the front pipe for the radiator. Because I'm having to use such a long extension, I did the conversion because my torque wrench here is in inch-pounds. 12 Newton meters is about 106 inch-pounds. So I'm going to just go with the top end, the 12. It gives me 4 Newton meters. So about every 3 inches, you're going to lose about a foot-pound. So we're probably not going to lose that much here. So if we just start at the 12, we're going to tighten it, kind of see how it feels. If I feel like it needs to go more, I may have to go a little more. Trying to do this without having the swivel on there, if I can. And so far so good. I think we're good. So we no longer have to wedge our intake. I think we're going to be alright. So now I'm going to do the 3 on the front here. It's much easier to torque them while it's on the car, something to hold it in place. And all these are able to be gotten to quite easily while it's on the car. So there we go. No modifications, no adjustments. Just simply replaced it with an aluminum housing. Got our new thermostat in and got everything torqued down. Just like our lower connection for the housing, We're going to do the same thing here for this pipe. Make sure our contacts are nice and clean. If they feel like they got something on here that's going to cause a problem, we'll just use our razor blade and just ever so lightly scrape any high pieces off. Oh, before I forget, we do need to get our knock sensor connectors snapped back on. While it's easy to get to them, this new housing had the snaps on it as well, so should just have to get them on there and slide them up. So we've got our right and left knock sensors connected, just like they should be. And on our cooling pipe, we want to go ahead and reconnect our sensor. My retainer actually broke on the connector, so I'm probably going to have to do something to help hold this in place. I think a little zip tie may work. It's got a little opening here with a tab of plastic left over. So once I do this, I slide it in place. This has another tab of plastic goes up and over. So if I just run a small little zip tie through there, hold that in place, I don't think it's going anywhere. Like I said, we're just going to run a zip tie through this opening, tie that off. There, that connector's not going anywhere. Just cut off our excess and be able to mount our pipe back on. Start our rubber pipes on. I'm going to line up our bolts to get them started. All 4 of these bolts are the same length. Don't have to worry about which one goes where. 8 to 12 Newton meters, which works out to about 106 inch-pounds. It doesn't seem like a whole lot, but do remember you're torquing down a piece of plastic that does have like a steel spacer in between to a piece of aluminum, so it's not going to have a whole lot of torque. At this point we have our housing on, our flange on, our thermostats in place, our hose for our radiator hose, and the channels going to each head. Temp sensor is reconnected. We've got our knock sensors snapped in place, and I think this time we're ready to start putting our hose clamps on here and then start bolting our intake back down. Just want to give you all a better look here. So there's the pipe, bolt on each side. There's the hose connection for the radiator with the thermostat inside, and there's our other pipe. There's a lower bolt for it. There we go, our hose that we replaced clamps back in place, and there with that clamp back in place on that one. And there's our knock sensor snapped back onto its bracket. Now there's one on the opposite side just like it. On the intake, I'm putting the bolts right back in the same holes they came out. Now if you have trouble getting to it, of course, fall back to the old trusty magnet. Now this back one does have a sensor here, so be careful not to get that bolt down around the wire that goes close to it. That way you don't pinch it. You're just going to run these down till they're just close, not even tight, because we still got to do the other side. You have to give the intake a little bit of a jiggle sometimes. And that is a steel bolt going into an aluminum head. That tends to cause corrosion. Alright, time to do this side. Putting the same bolt back into the same hole. Now, that back one is always the hard one because of the lines. We'll go ahead and get these run down. Once we've done this one, we'll shoot over here, and then from here we'll shoot over here. So kind of a crisscross pattern until we finally have them all tightened. But working your way from the inside out each direction. We went ahead and started the 2 bolts on the back side of the intake below the throttle body. So I'm going to go ahead and get this torqued down. So I decided to go, being as though I have such a long extension on here, Newton meters at request, the 22 actually works out to about 16.5 foot-pound. So I'm going with the lowest setting this one has, which is 20 foot-pound. But because I have such a long extension, it's still going to put it right around that same torque. We're starting with the center on this side. So on that side, going left to center. Technically the left to center if you were staying on that side. And straight across. Crisscross again. I'm going to crisscross one more time. And crisscross one more time. And cross again. So I want to make sure I do not pinch the wire to this sensor. Make sure it's clear before I tighten this down. And there we go. All 10 of those torqued down to 22 Newton meters. The covers line back up. 2 here and 2 here that have to go into the pins. There's one up here, but my bolt doesn't have a stud on it. This one goes underneath this hose. There we go. Slide that on. Snap that in place. This here, we have this hose that lines up right up here. I'm going to leave that loose for right now until we get our bolts down low tightened up. The cover shouldn't be in the way for for what else we got to do. There we go. Tighten that down good and tight. Instead of trying to use a socket and ratchet to get back down there, I just used a stubby ratcheting wrench. So now that way we've got those back in place. Intake's locked down. Time to put our hose on here. It's a return line. Actually, that's your overflow line is what that is, not your return line. This will be your return line. So line up the 2 studs with the rubber grommets. Line that up for the screw hole. And we're going to run our torque screw back down through here and tighten it back down. We also need to be sure and snug this up. So we snugged up our return line, snugged that down good. It's time to put our intake boot back on. Double check our throttle body, nothing's down in there. Slide this onto our intake filter here. And then slide this down on our throttle body. 2 screws here. Hold this in place. Just cinch them down. It is plastic, so don't get too rough with it. Double check that we're on our seal here. We'll tighten this hose clamp down. Simply going to snap our vent line in place and we're back together. So now we can move on back to our radiator and condenser so we can get the AC going.